The Royal Encounter. The early morning sun kissed the horizon, casting its golden glow over the bustling private airfield. The hum of jet engines and the distant buzz of ground crews created a symphony of activity. Amara Adebayo, a woman of poise and quiet authority, stepped out of a sleek black car. Her tailored outfit, a deep emerald coat and elegant cream scarf, exuded understated confidence. Her gaze swept over the tarmac, her expression calm yet resolute. Amara was no ordinary passenger. As a global philanthropist and CEO of a renowned medical foundation, she had dedicated her life to championing underprivileged communities. But her identity carried an even weightier secret. Amara was the last living descendant of an African royal dynasty, a lineage she kept out of the limelight to avoid unnecessary attention. Today's mission involved overseeing the delivery of critical medical supplies to a war-torn region, a task she approached with the same passion she gave to all her endeavors. David Mensah, her loyal assistant of 5 years, followed closely. A towering figure with an air of vigilance, David carried a leather portfolio containing itineraries, diplomatic letters, and all the paperwork necessary for their journey. His watchful eyes swept the area, a habit honed from years of navigating delicate international negotiations and unforeseen challenges. At the foot of the jet stairs, a striking woman in uniform awaited them. Rachel Collins, the lead flight attendant, greeted passengers with a meticulous blend of professionalism and caution. Her blonde hair was tied neatly into a bun, and her crisp uniform was immaculate. Yet the moment Rachel's eyes landed on Amara, a flicker of hesitation crossed her face. It was fleeting, but unmistakable. "Good morning," Rachel said, her tone polite but measured. "May I see your boarding passes or identification?" David stepped forward, sensing the undercurrent. "Miss Adebayo owns this aircraft," he stated firmly, handing over a dossier that confirmed her credentials. Rachel's eyes scanned the document but returned to Amara with a trace of skepticism. "I apologize, but for security reasons, I'll need to confirm this with our protocol. Please wait here." Amara remained composed, though the slight was clear. This wasn't the first time she had faced doubt or prejudice in such circumstances. She had long mastered the art of grace under scrutiny, but it never became less disheartening. David's jaw tightened as Rachel walked away, speaking into her headset. "This is ridiculous," David muttered. "They wouldn't dare question anyone else in your position." Amara placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let it be. Sometimes silence carries more weight than confrontation." Minutes ticked by, the delay drawing unwanted attention from the ground staff and other onlookers. Amara stood tall, her presence commanding despite the unwarranted suspicion. Her calm exterior masked the simmering frustration beneath. When Rachel returned, her expression had shifted. There was no denying the unease in her posture as she addressed them. "I've contacted the manager on duty for verification. It'll just take a moment." Before Amara could respond, a sleek black SUV pulled onto the tarmac. Out stepped Oliver Grant, the regional director of the aviation company, his face flushed with urgency. In his hand was a tablet displaying a portfolio of Amara's credentials and personal ownership documents. He approached with a brisk pace, his demeanor apologetic. "Miss Adebayo," he began, slightly out of breath, "please accept our sincerest apologies for this misunderstanding. There was no excuse for the delay or the inconvenience caused." Rachel's expression faltered as realization dawned. This wasn't just a client or a wealthy passenger. Amara's name carried weight far beyond her immediate grasp. "I wasn't informed," Rachel began, but Oliver silenced her with a sharp glance. "We'll discuss this later," he said curtly before turning back to Amara. Amara inclined her head slightly. "Apologies are unnecessary, Mr. Grant. What's done is done." Her words were gracious, but the undercurrent was undeniable. The incident spoke volumes about systemic biases that couldn't be dismissed with mere words. The supplies were loaded, the engines roared to life, and the jet finally took off. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy, a mix of awkward silence and unresolved tension. Amara sat by the window, gazing out at the clouds as the ground fell away beneath them. David sat across from her, his frustration evident. "You shouldn't have to deal with this," he said quietly. "I know," Amara replied, her voice soft but firm. "But every step forward in a world that resists change is a victory." As the jet soared into the sky, Amara reflected on the journey ahead, not just the physical one but the ongoing battle for dignity, respect, and equality. She wasn't just a passenger. She was a beacon for those who couldn't speak for themselves. And today's encounter was a reminder that her work was far from over. The first chapter of the journey ended, leaving behind a ripple that would resonate far beyond the tarmac. Reckoning in the sky. The private jet cruised smoothly at 30,000 feet, the engines humming steadily against the backdrop of an endless blue sky. Amara sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Outside, the vast expanse of the earth below seemed serene and untouched, a stark contrast to the quiet turbulence lingering in the cabin. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, her fingers grazing the smooth silk of her scarf. A gift from her late grandmother, a reminder of her heritage and the strength that came with it. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat across from her, his tablet abandoned on the table. The earlier confrontation at the airfield weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just the delay or the unnecessary questioning. It was the principle. The sheer audacity of being stopped, doubted, and scrutinized despite everything Amara represented. "She looked at you like you didn't belong," David muttered, breaking the silence. His tone carried an edge, though he kept his voice low. "Like you were intruding on your own plane." Amara didn't respond immediately. She continued to watch the horizon, her thoughts far away. David's frustration was justified, but she had learned to temper her emotions in moments like these. The weight of expectation as a global figure, and as a black woman, meant choosing battles carefully. "David," she said finally, her voice calm but tinged with weariness, "this isn't the first time. It won't be the last. It shouldn't happen at all," he shot back. "Not to you." "It shouldn't happen to anyone," she corrected, turning her gaze toward him. Her eyes, steady and resolute, carried the wisdom of someone who had endured countless such moments. "But here we are." David leaned back in his seat, rubbing his temples. "Do you think she even understands what she did? What it means?" Amara shook her head. "People like Rachel don't see the world the way we do. They don't carry the same weight. To her, it was just a matter of protocol. A misunderstanding. She'll convince herself it wasn't personal." "But it was," David argued. "It always is." Before Amara could respond, a soft knock came from the door leading to the crew quarters. Rachel appeared, her posture stiff and her face carefully neutral. She carried a tray with 2 glasses of water and a steaming teapot, her movements deliberate. "Miss Adebayo, Mr. Mensah," she began, her voice steady but lacking its earlier authority. "I wanted to apologize again for the inconvenience at the airfield. It was not my intention to offend." Amara regarded her silently for a moment, her expression unreadable. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she placed the tray on the table. She hesitated, as though expecting a response, but when none came, she straightened and stepped back. "If there's anything I can do to make the rest of your journey more comfortable, please let me know," Rachel added. David scoffed under his breath, but Amara raised a hand to silence him. "Thank you, Rachel," she said simply, her tone measured. Rachel nodded and retreated, though her shoulders remained tense as she disappeared down the aisle. The cabin door clicked shut behind her, leaving Amara and David alone once more. "She didn't mean it," David said after a moment, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "She's just trying to cover herself now that she knows who you are." Amara reached for the teapot, pouring herself a cup of tea with deliberate precision. "Perhaps," she replied, her voice calm. "But intentions matter less than impact. Whether she meant it or not, the damage is the same." David sighed heavily. I just don't get how you stay so composed. After everything you've achieved, everything you've done for people, how can they still look at you and see less? Amara took a sip of her tea, the warmth grounding her. Because change is slow, she said, and prejudice is deeply ingrained. It's not about me, David. It's about what I represent, a disruption to the narrative they've been taught. David shook his head, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. It's exhausting. It is, she agreed. But the only way forward is through. The conversation lapsed into silence, the weight of their exchange lingering in the air. Amara returned her gaze to the window, her reflection staring back at her. She thought of her mother, who had faced similar struggles in academia, and her grandmother, who had fought against colonial rule. They had paved the way for her, but the path was still far from smooth. As the jet sailed across the sky, a chime sounded, signaling an incoming message. David checked his tablet, his brow furrowing. "It's from Oliver," he said, glancing up at Amara. "He wants to arrange a meeting to discuss what happened." Amara's lips curved into a faint, ironic smile. "Damage control," she murmured. David tilted his head. "Are you going to take the meeting?" Amara set her cup down, her fingers tracing the rim thoughtfully. "Yes," she said finally, "but not for his sake." David frowned. "Then for whose?" "For Rachel's," Amara replied. "And for every person who comes after me." David leaned back, his expression softening. He didn't fully understand, but he trusted her. Amara had a way of turning even the smallest moments into lessons, of finding purpose in pain. She wasn't just enduring these battles. She was building bridges for others to cross. As the jet continued its journey, the cabin lights dimmed, and the world outside shifted into twilight. But inside, Amara's resolve burned bright, a quiet flame that refused to be extinguished. The ties that bind. The late afternoon sun bathed the private airfield below in a golden haze as Amara's private jet cruised at altitude, the hum of the engines a constant backdrop. The serenity outside was in stark contrast to the turbulent emotions swirling inside her. Amara sat at the window, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of clouds. Her tea, untouched, had long since cooled, but her thoughts were anything but still. David sat across from her, scrolling absently through his tablet, his brow furrowed. He hadn't spoken in minutes, his frustration from earlier simmering just beneath the surface. Amara had learned to recognize his quiet anger. It was a protective instinct, a deeply ingrained sense of loyalty that often led him to take perceived slights against her personally. But for Amara, the incident with Rachel wasn't about the attendant herself. It was a symptom of something larger, something deeper. Prejudice wasn't new to her. It was a constant, shadowing every achievement and every step forward. And yet, the weight of it never became easier to bear. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of the cabin intercom. The captain's voice crackled through. "Miss Adebayo, we'll be entering some light turbulence shortly. Please ensure you are seated and buckled in." David looked up, his fingers stilling on the tablet. "You'd think the turbulence might have come earlier," he muttered, half to himself. "It would have fit the day." Amara smiled faintly, her gaze remaining fixed on the window. "Turbulence is inevitable, David. It's how we navigate it that matters." Before David could respond, the cabin door slid open. Rachel appeared again, her movements hesitant. She carried a tray with 2 fresh cups of tea, the porcelain rattling faintly as she set it on the table. Her face was carefully composed, but her eyes betrayed her unease. "Miss Adebayo," Rachel began, her voice softer this time. "I've prepared a fresh pot for you. I hope it's to your liking." Amara's expression remained neutral as she looked up at the attendant. "Thank you, Rachel," she said simply. Rachel hesitated, as though weighing whether to say more. Finally, she added, "I also taken the liberty of reviewing the procedures in case there's anything I can do to ensure a smoother experience in the future." David raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "A little late for that, isn't it?" he said, his tone sharp. Amara shot him a glance, a silent warning to stand down. "It's appreciated," she said to Rachel, her tone measured. The attendant nodded and retreated, leaving the cabin door slightly ajar. David exhaled heavily, leaning back in his seat. "She's trying. I'll give her that. But it feels hollow." Amara stirred her tea, her movements slow and deliberate. "Trying is the first step, David. We don't change minds overnight." "Do you really believe she'll change?" he asked, skeptical. Amara's gaze drifted to the door. "People can surprise you, but it's not just about Rachel. It's about the system that allowed her to see me as a question instead of an answer." David sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "That's what makes it so exhausting. It's never just one person or one incident." Amara nodded. "That's why we have to keep going. Because every conversation, every moment like this, plants a seed. It may not bear fruit immediately, but it sets the stage for growth." The turbulence began, a gentle rocking of the plane that mirrored the undercurrent of their conversation. Amara took a sip of her tea, savoring the warmth. It reminded her of her grandmother, who used to sit with her during quiet evenings, sharing stories of resilience and survival. Amara's grandmother, Amina, had been a force of nature. Born into a colonized land, Amina had fought tooth and nail to claim her education, her voice, and her independence. Amara remembered the nights they'd spent on the veranda, the scent of jasmine in the air as Amina recounted her struggles. "People will always try to put you in a box, Amara," she'd said once, her voice firm but kind. "It's easier for them if they can label you, dismiss you, control you. But you must never let them. You define who you are." Those words had stayed with Amara, shaping her approach to the world. Even now, decades later, they resonated. She reached up to touch the delicate gold necklace she wore, a gift from Amina, passed down through generations of women in their family. It was a symbol of strength, a reminder that she was part of something greater than herself. David interrupted her reverie. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" Amara looked at him, surprised. "How did you know?" "You get that look," he said with a faint smile. "The one that says you're halfway between here and somewhere else." She chuckled softly. "I was thinking about my grandmother. She had a way of putting things into perspective." David leaned forward, his interest piqued. What would she say about today? Amara considered the question carefully. "She'd probably remind me that this isn't new, that every step forward has always been met with resistance, but she'd also tell me to keep walking." David smiled, his frustration softening. "She sounds like an incredible woman." "She was," Amara said, her voice tinged with pride. "And she taught me that strength isn't just about standing tall. It's about knowing when to bend, when to listen, and when to speak." The turbulence subsided and the plane leveled out. Amara leaned back in her seat, her gaze once again drawn to the window. Below, the world stretched out like a patchwork quilt, its beauty reminding her of why she did what she did. For all its flaws, the world was worth fighting for. David broke the silence. "You know, I think you're right. About planting seeds." Amara glanced at him, intrigued. "Oh." He nodded. "Rachel might not change overnight, but if anyone can make her think, it's you. And maybe that's enough for now." Amara smiled faintly. "It's a start." The intercom chimed again, and the captain's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're on track to arrive on schedule. Please prepare for descent shortly." As the jet began its gradual descent, Amara felt a sense of resolve settle over her. The day had been challenging, but it wasn't the challenges that defined her. It was how she met them, how she carried them, and how she turned them into opportunities for growth. Below, the city lights came into view, twinkling like stars against the darkening sky. Amara tightened her grip on her grandmother's necklace, a quiet promise to herself and to the generations before and after her. This wasn't just a journey. It was a continuation of a legacy, and she was determined to carry it forward. The weight of legacy. The private jet's smooth descent toward the glowing city below mirrored the ebbing tension in the cabin. Amara remained seated by the window, her posture regal and composed, yet the stillness in her hands betrayed the currents of thought stirring beneath her calm exterior. The city lights stretched out like a sea of diamonds, promising the bustle of life and the complexities of another chapter in her ongoing mission. David, seated across from her, was scrolling through his tablet, updating itineraries and confirming logistics for their arrival. His earlier frustration had given way to quiet contemplation. The subdued atmosphere between them was thick with unspoken words, the kind that carried the weight of shared history and mutual understanding. Breaking the silence, David leaned back, his voice low. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it, Amara? All the work, the battles, the sacrifices. Do you ever think about what it would be like to walk away from it all?" Amara turned her gaze from the window, studying his face. David rarely allowed himself moments of vulnerability, but when he did, it revealed the depth of his commitment and the toll it took on him. "It's crossed my mind," she admitted, her voice soft but unwavering. "There are days when the weight feels unbearable, but then I think about what walking away would mean. For me, for the people we help, and for the ones who came before us." David nodded, though his brow remained furrowed. "You mean your family?" Amara smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the delicate gold necklace around her neck. "Yes, my family. And the countless others who fought battles we'll never fully understand. My grandmother used to say that we don't carry burdens alone. We carry them with the strength of those who came before us." David tilted his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'd like to have met her." "She would have liked you," Amara replied with a chuckle. "But she wouldn't have let you get away with your cynicism." David laughed softly, the tension between them easing. "Sounds like my kind of woman." The jet touched down with a gentle thud, its sleek frame gliding effortlessly along the runway. As the engines powered down, the cabin crew prepared for their arrival. Amara gathered her belongings with the same precision and care that defined her approach to everything in life. When the cabin door opened, a rush of cool evening air swept inside, carrying with it the distant hum of city life. A black SUV waited on the tarmac, its polished exterior reflecting the golden glow of the airport lights. Standing beside it was a familiar figure, Oliver Grant, the regional director who had made a rushed appearance earlier to apologize for the incident at the airfield. As Amara descended the jet stairs, her heels clicking against the metal, Oliver stepped forward, his expression a blend of contrition and professionalism. He extended his hand, his grip firm but respectful. "Miss Adebayo," he began, his tone measured, "thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I know this evening has been complicated." Amara inclined her head slightly, her expression neutral. "Complications are part of the job, Mr. Grant. Let's not keep them waiting." David, ever watchful, trailed closely behind as they made their way to the SUV. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but polite. Oliver sat across from Amara, adjusting his tie as though it were suddenly too tight. "I've arranged for a meeting with our senior staff to address what happened earlier," Oliver said, his words carefully chosen. "We take incidents like these seriously, and we're committed to ensuring they don't happen again." Amara regarded him silently for a moment, her gaze steady. "And what exactly do you plan to address, Mr. Grant? The actions of one individual, or the culture that allowed it to happen?" Oliver hesitated, clearly unprepared for the directness of her question. "Both," he said finally. "But these things take time." Amara leaned forward, her hands clasped in her lap. "Time is a luxury some of us don't have, Mr. Grant. The incident with your flight attendant was not an isolated event. It's part of a larger pattern, a pattern that affects people like me every day." Oliver shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping momentarily before meeting hers again. "I understand, Miss Adebayo, and I want to assure you that we're listening." "Listening is a start," she said, her tone calm but firm. "But it's not enough. Change requires action, not just words." The SUV wove through the city streets, the vibrant pulse of urban life visible through the tinted windows. Amara's thoughts drifted as they passed towering skyscrapers and bustling intersections. She remembered her first trip to this city as a young woman, fresh out of university and full of ambition. Back then, she had been driven by a desire to prove herself, to make her mark on the world. Now her motivations were different. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about paving the way for others. David broke the silence. You think they'll actually make changes, or is this just another PR move? Amara sighed softly. It's hard to say, but if nothing else, they'll know we're watching. Sometimes, that's enough to start a ripple. The SUV pulled up to the entrance of a luxurious hotel, its grand facade illuminated by soft golden lights. A small team of staff awaited their arrival, their smiles polished and practiced. As Amara stepped out, the weight of the day seemed to press more heavily on her shoulders. Inside, the hotel lobby was a symphony of elegance, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the gentle murmur of guests. Amara and David were escorted to a private lounge, where a small group of executives from the aviation company awaited them. Oliver led the way, his posture stiff but determined. The meeting was a mix of formalities and promises, each executive carefully towing the line between accountability and self-preservation. Amara listened attentively, her responses measured and thoughtful. She didn't need to raise her voice to command the room. Her presence alone was enough. Later, as the meeting concluded and the executives dispersed, Oliver lingered. "Miss Adebayo," he said, his tone more candid now that they were alone. "I hope tonight's discussion gave you some confidence in our commitment to improvement." Amara regarded him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Grant, confidence is earned through action, not promises. I'll be watching to see how you follow through." Oliver nodded, his demeanor humbled. "Fair enough. And thank you for your patience." Patience. The word lingered in Amara's mind as she and David made their way to the elevator. Patience was a virtue, but it was also a burden. It required enduring the weight of injustice, trusting that the seeds of change would eventually bear fruit. As they reached their suite, David turned to her, his expression lighter now. "You handled that well." Amara smiled faintly, her exhaustion evident. "It's not about handling it, David. It's about making sure the next person doesn't have to." He nodded, understanding her deeper meaning. "You're paving the way." "We're paving it," she corrected gently. "It's a collective effort." David smiled, his respect for her unwavering. "Then let's keep paving." As the city lights twinkled outside their suite, Amara allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The battles she fought were never easy, but they were necessary. And as long as there was work to be done, she would keep going. The weight of legacy was heavy, but it was one she carried with pride. Building bridges in the shadows, the soft hum of the city below filtered through the towering windows of Amara's hotel suite, a distant melody of life that never seemed to sleep. The room was bathed in the glow of warm amber lights, casting long shadows across the plush carpet and minimalist decor. Amara sat at a small writing desk near the window, her pen moving steadily across a leather-bound journal. This was her ritual, a way to ground herself after days that carried more weight than most could bear. The journal was a place where her thoughts flowed freely, unencumbered by the expectations of the world outside. Tonight, her words were heavier than usual, shaped by the events of the day and the echoes of the past. Across the room, David lounged on the sofa, scrolling through his tablet. His tie was loosened, and his usual polished demeanor had given way to an unguarded exhaustion. Yet his eyes, sharp and attentive, darted toward Amara every so often. He had learned over the years to recognize when her silence carried the heaviest burdens. "Anything in particular you're writing about?" David finally asked, breaking the quiet. Amara didn't look up. "Reflections," she said simply. "On today, on yesterday, on the patterns that never seemed to break." David set his tablet aside, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You think what happened at the airport will stick with them? Or was this just another PR crisis for them to spin? Amara capped her pen and closed the journal, her gaze shifting to the cityscape outside. I can't control how they process it, but I can make sure the story doesn't fade. That's where the real power lies, in making sure these moments don't get buried under the weight of their excuses. David nodded slowly. And Rachel? You think she learned anything? Amara's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Rachel's story is just beginning. Whether she grows from it is up to her, but I planted a seed. That's all I can do. The next morning, the city was alive with the energy of a new day. Amara and David arrived at the conference center, a sprawling glass structure that shimmered in the early sunlight. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation. The event Amara had come to attend was not just a routine part of her work. It was an opportunity to shape narratives, to foster connections that could ripple far beyond the walls of the room. As they entered, Amara was greeted with the kind of reverence that came with her reputation. Hands extended, smiles widened, and voices carried tones of admiration and awe. Yet, as always, there was a subtle undercurrent of skepticism from some, a hesitation, a quiet doubt that lingered just out of reach. David, ever perceptive, picked up on it immediately. Some of these people still can't believe you belong here, he muttered under his breath as they walked through the crowd. Amara smiled faintly. That's why I'm here, to remind them that I do. The morning sessions were a blur of panels and discussions, each one tackling critical issues ranging from healthcare access to sustainable development. Amara's contributions were met with applause and nods of agreement, but she knew that true change required more than just words exchanged in a polished auditorium. During the lunch break, Amara found herself at a quiet table in the corner of the venue, away from the bustle of the networking crowd. She was savoring a moment of peace when Rachel approached, her expression tentative. Miss Adebayo, Rachel began, her voice steady but cautious. I wasn't sure if I'd see you again before your departure, but I wanted to thank you for how you handled things yesterday. Amara looked up, her expression unreadable. What are you thanking me for, Rachel? The question caught Rachel off guard. She hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. For your patience, she said finally. For not making a scene. For giving me a chance to reflect. Amara set her fork down and leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the young woman. And what did you reflect on? Rachel swallowed hard, her composure wavering. On how I saw you, she admitted. On why I assumed, what I assumed. It wasn't right, and I realize now that it was more about me than it was about you. Amara studied her for a moment, then gestured for Rachel to sit. The attendant obeyed, her posture stiff and uncertain. Rachel, Amara began, her tone calm but firm. What you experienced yesterday wasn't just about me. It was about every person who looks like me, who walks into spaces where they're not expected to belong. Your assumptions are part of a larger system, a system that teaches us who fits where and why. Rachel nodded, her eyes downcast. I see that now. I want to do better. Amara's gaze softened slightly. Wanting to do better is a good start, but wanting isn't enough. You need to act. And more importantly, you need to listen to voices that challenge your perspective, to stories that aren't like your own. Rachel met her gaze, a flicker of determination in her eyes. I will. I promise. Amara inclined her head. Then start by asking yourself the difficult questions, the ones that make you uncomfortable. That's where growth begins. Rachel nodded, standing as if dismissed. Thank you, she said again, her voice more certain this time. For everything. As she walked away, David approached the table, his expression curious. What was that about? Amara smiled faintly, a step forward. The rest of the day unfolded with the same intensity as the morning. But something had shifted. Amara felt it in the way people approached her, in the subtle changes in tone and posture. The ripples of her presence were spreading, touching corners she hadn't anticipated. By evening, as she and David returned to their hotel, Exhaustion had set in. Yet there was a sense of fulfillment, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she had made an impact. "Do you ever get tired of being the one to lead these conversations?" David asked as they entered the suite. Amara set her bag down and turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but then I remember that it's not just about me. It's about the bridges we build for others to cross." David nodded, his respect for her clear. "You're not just building bridges, Amara. You're reshaping the entire landscape." She smiled, her eyes bright with determination. "One step at a time, David. One step at a time." The ripple of change. The glow of the evening city lights illuminated the skyline as Amara sat on the balcony of her hotel suite, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. Below, the hum of traffic and the distant chatter of pedestrians created a symphony of life, a reminder of the ceaseless energy that defined the urban landscape. The events of the past days weighed heavily on her, yet they also fueled her resolve. Inside, David paced the room, his phone pressed to his ear as he finalized the logistics for their departure. His movements were precise, his voice steady, a pillar of efficiency. Despite the day's exhaustion, he carried himself with the same determination that had brought them both this far. When he ended the call, he joined Amara on the balcony, leaning against the railing. "Flights confirmed for tomorrow morning," he said, his tone lighter than it had been earlier. "No surprises this time. I made sure of it." Amara smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the city below. "Good. I think we've had our fill of surprises for one trip." David chuckled, but his expression quickly turned serious. "You think what we did here will stick? With Rachel, with Oliver, with the others?" Amara took a sip of her tea, savoring the warmth. "Change doesn't happen in a single moment, David. It's a process. A slow, painful one. But every conversation, every interaction, plants a seed. Whether it grows depends on the people we've touched." David nodded, his brow furrowed. Rachel seemed genuine. "Do you think she'll keep her promise to reflect, to act?" "Time will tell," Amara said. "But the fact that she approached me, that she acknowledged her biases, is a start. It's more than I've seen from many others." David sighed, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I just hate that you have to keep doing this, fighting the same battles over and over again." Amara set her cup down and turned to him, her expression calm but resolute. "Every battle we fight, every step we take, makes it easier for the ones who come after us. That's why we do it, David. Not for immediate results, but for the legacy we leave behind." The next morning, the air was crisp and clear as they arrived at the private airfield. The sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, the light catching on the polished surface of the jet. This time, there were no delays, no questions, no misplaced doubts. The staff greeted them with warm smiles and efficient service, a marked contrast to the tension of their arrival. As Amara and David boarded the plane, she noticed Rachel standing near the entrance. Her posture was straight, her uniform impeccable, but there was a new softness in her expression, a humility that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Miss Adebayo," Rachel said, her voice steady but sincere. "I wanted to thank you again for what you said to me. It's given me a lot to think about." Amara paused, studying the young woman. "Thinking is good, Rachel. But don't stop there. Let your actions reflect what you've learned." Rachel nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I will. I promise." Amara inclined her head in acknowledgement, then stepped into the cabin. David followed, his expression thoughtful. "She seems different," he remarked as they settled into their seats. "She is," Amara said simply. "Growth is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. She's starting to see the world through a different lens. That's the first step." As the jet ascended into the sky, the city below shrinking into a patchwork of lights and shadows, Amara felt a sense of peace. The turbulence of the past days had settled, leaving behind clarity and purpose. She turned her attention to the folder in her lap, filled with plans for their next initiative. a project aimed at providing sustainable healthcare solutions to underserved communities. David watched her for a moment before speaking. "You never stop, do you?" Amara looked up, her smile gentle. "The work doesn't stop, David, and neither can we." Hours later, as the jet cruised above the clouds, Amara allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought about her grandmother, Amina, and the lessons she had imparted. Amina had always spoken about the power of resilience, about the importance of standing tall even when the world tried to push you down. Amara reached for the delicate gold necklace around her neck, a tangible connection to her heritage and the women who had come before her. They had faced their own battles, paved their own paths, and now it was her turn to carry the torch. David broke the silence. "You think they'll remember you here? Not just for the conference, but for what happened at the airport?" Amara met his gaze, her eyes steady. "They'll remember, David, not because of who I am, but because of what I stood for. And that's enough." David nodded, his respect for her evident. "You're building something bigger than all of us, Amara." She smiled, her gaze returning to the horizon. "We all are, one step at a time." As the journey continued, the jet sailing smoothly through the sky, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battles she fought were not just hers, they were for the countless others who couldn't yet fight for themselves. And as long as there was work to be done, she would keep going. Below her, the world stretched out in endless possibilities, and above, the clouds parted, revealing a vast expanse of blue, limitless, eternal, and full of promise. The echo of change. The hours passed quietly as the jet glided through the clouds, the hum of the engines a steady backdrop to Amara's thoughts. She sat in her seat, reviewing the documents in her lap, proposals for the healthcare initiative that had brought her here in the first place. Each page was a testament to the work she had dedicated her life to, the culmination of years spent building bridges where others had seen only divides. David, seated across from her, had drifted into a light sleep, his head leaning against the window. Amara smiled faintly. His dedication to her mission had always been unwavering, but she knew the toll it took on him. The quiet moments like these were rare, and she was grateful for his presence. Her thoughts turned to the past few days, the incident at the airport, the conversations with Rachel, and the tense meeting with the aviation executives. Each moment, while exhausting, had served a purpose. Amara had seen the small shifts in perception, the seeds of change beginning to take root. She knew better than to expect immediate results, but she also knew the power of persistence. The jet began its descent as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Amara closed the folder in her lap, setting it aside as she looked out the window. The city below was a patchwork of lights, a living, breathing testament to humanity's resilience and ingenuity. It reminded her of why she did what she did, why she endured the battles, the questions, the doubts. When the plane touched down, the airport was quiet, the tarmac illuminated by the soft glow of overhead lights. As Amara and David disembarked, a small team awaited them, ready to assist with their next steps. Among them, Amara noticed Rachel standing to the side, her posture straight and her expression determined. Rachel approached as Amara reached the bottom of the stairs, her hands clasped in front of her. "Miss Adebayo," she began, her voice steady, "I just wanted to let you know that I've decided to take some steps to educate myself, to challenge the biases I didn't even realize I had." Amara regarded her for a moment, her expression softening. "That's a brave decision, Rachel. Growth is never easy, but it's always worth it." Rachel nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I want to do better, not just for myself, but for the people I serve." Amara extended her hand, and Rachel took it, her grip firm. "You're on the right path. Keep going." As Rachel stepped back, David watched the exchange with a faint smile. "You really have a way of leaving an impression," he said as they walked toward their waiting car. Amara shrugged lightly, her smile enigmatic. "Sometimes, all people need is a little nudge. The ride to their next destination was quiet, the city lights flashing past the windows. Amara leaned back in her seat, her thoughts already moving forward. The road ahead was long, and the challenges were far from over, but moments like these reminded her of the progress being made, however small, however incremental. David broke the silence. "So, what's next?" Amara turned to him, her eyes bright with determination. "Next, we keep building. The work never ends, David. But that's the beauty of it. Every step we take, every battle we fight, it all adds up." He nodded, his admiration for her evident. "You're unstoppable, you know that." Amara chuckled softly. "Not unstoppable, just determined." As they arrived at their destination, Amara stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement. She paused for a moment, taking in the scene before her. A gathering of people, diverse and vibrant, ready to join her in the next chapter of her mission. The weight of her legacy, the battles fought, and the bridges built all led to this moment. And as Amara stepped forward, her resolve unwavering, she knew that her story was not just hers. It was a part of something far greater, a ripple that would echo for generations to come. The end was never really the end. It was a new beginning, and Amara was ready to face it, one step at a time.